Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I make my Roman Gladius Dagger in Etch graphics on metal. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the blade. I'll use 4140 tool steel and I'll attach my template with some magnets. Then I'll spray paint the billet and I'll use the cutoff wheel on my angle grinder and cut out the profile. I'll finish grinding the profile with the belt grinder. I use the tool ink layout fluid to spray the blade. That way I could use the calipers to mark where I want the bevels and the plunge lines. And I'll use a drill bit a little thinner than the thickness of the blade. That way I could put 2 lines down the center of the blade and then grind up to each line. That way I can leave the edge a little bit thick for the heat treat. I'll use a file jig and make sure the shoulders are even and match where it'll fit into the guard. I'll grind my bevels as close to the scribe lines as I can get, and then I'll use my file to dial everything in. I lost the footage from the heat treat, but all I did was heat the blade to 1550 degrees and then quench it in the Parks 50 quench oil. And then after a temper cycle at 400 degrees, I'll hand sand the surface to 600 grit, and now I'm ready to etch the blade. I'll use my Cricut Joy to cut the vinyl stickers. I use permanent vinyl, so that way I know it'll stick real nice to the metal. And I use the Cricut Joy transfer tape. I've tried regular tape before, but the regular packing tape is a little flimsy. It'll work in a pinch though. I'll use the isopropyl alcohol to make sure I clean the surface of the metal really good. I don't want any oils or debris or fingerprints on the blade. I'll make sure the surfaces are really clean so the stickers will stick real nice. You can use automotive pinstriping to do borders and stuff like that. The automotive pinstriping is also a permanent vinyl, so it works really well. Electrical tape works okay, but you can't get it too hot. If you get it too warm, it can end up peeling up on you and then etch where you didn't want it to. I use my 12-volt battery charger for the power supply, and for my etching solution, I'll just use regular table salt and tap water. I'll secure a cotton ball to the end of a brass rod with some electrical tape and connect that to the ground of the battery charger. And I hook the positive up to the piece that I'm trying to etch. And I'll make sure to submerge the cotton ball in the salt water. The amp gauge reads about 3 or 4 amps, which is pretty good, so that'll etch pretty fast. So I usually do about 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi max because I don't want it to overheat. So now I'll just remove all the stickers, and I'll use the razor blade and carefully remove the vinyl stickers and then scrub it in the sink with Dawn dish soap to get rid of all the residue. I'll use the aluminum black metal finish and apply it to the entire image. That way when I sand over the top, it'll leave the background with that nice black finish. I'll sand the surface to about 1000 grit for now, and then I'll switch gears and work on the hilt. I'll use brass and a redwood for the handle construction. I'll use a 1/4 inch piece of brass and a 1/8 inch piece of brass, and I actually don't end up using that thinner piece. For the guard, I'm going to use the 1/8 inch thick piece of brass. I'll use the tool ink layout fluid and mark the profile of the guard, and then use the hacksaw to cut that piece out. And I'll use the belt grinder to grind right up to the scribe line. I'll mark a slot for the tang, and then I'll make sure to use a drill bit a little bit thinner than the tang. That way I can use a smaller end mill and mill right up to the scribe lines. I'll drill a few holes down the center of the tang, that way I can just mill out the space between those holes. Once the blade fits onto the guard, I'll mark where the ricasso meets the guard, and then I'll just mill out as much of the material as I can with the end mill. I'll use the Dremel to remove the leftover material in the corners. I'm using the tungsten carbide tips in my Dremel. I decided to use my chop saw so I can get perfect cuts down this. I didn't realize just how bad of an idea that was going to be. I should have never tried to cut a piece of wood that small in the chop saw. I got lucky with the first two cuts. If the piece isn't long enough to clamp down, definitely use the bandsaw. Wow, that's crazy. Well, I'll use the bandsaw from now on. I have another piece of wood coming in the mail, so for now I'm just going to finish making all the brass parts. I'll use the 1/8 inch brass to make all the pieces that go between the finger grooves. To cut perfect circles, I'll use my hole saw and the milling machine. And I'll use the 1/4 inch brass for the center spacer in the pommel. So I got all my brass spacers done, and I just got my new piece of wood in the mail. So I'm gonna switch gears and start cutting all the pieces for the hilt. This time I used the bandsaw and cut a slice for each piece that I need. And since I got this new piece of wood that's a lot longer than the first piece I had, I cut the guard into 2 sections and the pommel into 4 sections. And I only cut 2 sections for the handle pieces and then cut those in half to make the 4 pieces. So I'll use the guard as a template and mark where I need to cut it out. Then I'll go back to the bandsaw and cut as much material out as I can, and then take it to the belt grinder and grind right up to the scribe line. And I'll do that with all the wood pieces for the guard and pommel. And then I'll do the same thing for all the handle pieces. Now I can switch to the milling machine and mill each piece perfectly flat with each other. And I'll do the same thing with the pieces for the guard and the pommel. I wanted the spacers to be a little bit thinner than the guard, so I did a couple passes on the milling machine and thinned out the spacers some. I thinned out the spacers on the pommel as well. The center spacer in the pommel I left nice and thick though, so I'll just mill the slot and leave it the thickness that it is. So now I'm going to mill the slot for the tang on all the wood pieces for the guard and pommel. So I'll use the guard for a template and mark where I need to mill the slot. I'll use my longer end mill to mill the thicker pieces, and I'll make sure to mill it to the width that it needs to be for that section of the tang. So once I have all the slots milled for the guard and pommel pieces, I'll tap all the holes from drilling out the brass pieces. I used a milling machine to do the threads, that way I know they're nice and straight. Then I'll drill holes in the wood pieces the same size as from the hole saw. And I'll thread those holes as well. I'm using the 5/16 tap so I can thread this up on the 5/16 all thread. I'll twist all the pieces up together nice and tight. Now I can chuck it up into the lathe and turn everything down flush with each other. Once I get all the pieces flush with each other, I'll take this piece off the lathe, then put a little piece of metal here to raise up the platform, and then I'll use my wood turning gouges to turn the wooden finger grooves on the handle. So now I have the shape of the finger grooves. I can go ahead and take these off of the awl thread and start milling slots for the tang. So if I try to clamp these pieces directly in the vise, I'll ruin them. So I came up with this little jig here to protect the pieces from the clamp. And I'll use the longer end mill so it'll reach all the way through to the bottom. So now I'm gonna glue up all the parts for the guard and the pommel. I'll mix up some 5-minute epoxy, and I'll apply the epoxy to every surface between each layer, and then I'll clamp them up and let them cure. Once the glue cures on the guard and pommel, I'll clean the surfaces up on the belt grinder, and then I'll mark where I want to grind the profile, and I'll also mark where the handle meets the guard and pommel. So first, I'll work on this axis and grind it as round as I can without going over the lines where I marked where it'll meet the handle. I'll make sure not to grind past the circles that I drew around the tang. And then I'll do the same thing with the guard. Once I'm done with the front, I'll switch to the side and then round over those edges. I'll do the same thing and grind right up to the circles where it's going to meet the handle and just round over the edges. Once I get the edges rounded out, I'll start on the corners and then blend all of that together to round everything out. Before I start moving up the grits and smoothing everything out, I want to thread the tang and do a pommel nut. So first I'll grind a square, and then I'll grind a 45-degree bevel on all 4 corners, and then I'll round everything over from there. I did end up making it a little bit longer, so I went back to the grinder and I made it longer, and then I threaded it with a 1224 die. I'll use a piece of scrap brass to turn into a pommel nut, and then I'll be done with all the pieces. I hand sanded each piece to 3000 grit and polished, and now it's finally done. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you like this video, please click the like button and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.